When Christians cheer deportations, would Jesus ask about the family? That is the question we have to ask before border policy becomes a chant, before enforcement becomes entertainment, and before families become numbers on a screen. A country has borders for a reason. Law matters because chaos hurts ordinary people first. Families need safety, workers need stability, and citizens deserve a government that tells the truth about who enters, who stays, and how the law is enforced. Christians do not have to pretend government has no responsibility. Romans 13 is still in the Bible. So are wisdom, justice, and the duty to protect peace. But Jesus never allowed law to erase the human being standing in front of us. And he never taught his followers to celebrate when a family is torn apart. Right now, evangelical organizations are warning that large-scale deportation policies could separate more than 1 million people from their families, if current plans continue at expected rates. They are not saying every deportation is unjust. That matters. This is not open borders versus no mercy. It is a harder question, and harder questions are usually where Jesus meets us. What happens when Christians who care about order stop asking what the policy does to the family? What happens when people who worship the Son of God, who entered the world through a family, forget to ask about mothers, fathers, spouses, children, churches, and homes that do not fit neatly into a political slogan? Jesus would ask about the family, and that question does not make border security irrelevant. It makes Christian conscience unavoidable. If this question matters to you, subscribe and stay with me, because this is not about whether America should have immigration laws. It is about whether Christians can discuss those laws without losing the heart of Jesus, a difference that is easy to lose when fear and anger start doing the talking. A lot of Americans are tired. They hear about a strained border, overwhelmed cities, broken immigration courts, families waiting for years, communities carrying costs, and politicians using the issue every election season. They hear about crime, jobs, schools, housing, and public resources. Some concerns are real. It would be dishonest to pretend every worry is hatred. Ordinary Americans are allowed to ask whether their government is functioning, but it would also be dishonest to pretend deportation is only an administrative word. For some families, it means an empty chair at dinner, a child asking whether dad is coming home, a spouse trying to explain a legal system even adults barely understand. It can mean a pastor leading a congregation while wondering whether his own family will still be with him next week. It can mean church members praying, calling lawmakers, bringing meals, and realizing immigration policy is no longer an abstract debate on television. It has entered the pews, the kitchen, the whispered hallway conversations, and the Sunday morning moment when a familiar family is missing from the row where they always sat. Far from the consequences, deportation can sound like a headline. For a church that knows the name, the face, the prayer request, and the children, it becomes much harder to cheer. That is where the argument changes. Washington loves abstractions because abstractions are easier to sell. Deportations, enforcement, national security, the rule of law. Even harsher labels get thrown around until a person is reduced to legal status and nothing more. Some words describe real categories, but they can also flatten souls. They can turn a mother into a case, a child into collateral, a marriage into paperwork, and a church member into a political talking point. Jesus did not see people that way. Jesus saw the person under the label. He looked past the categories people used to keep their distance. The sick man was not merely a disruption. The woman at the well was not merely a reputation. The tax collector was not merely the hated category everyone had already judged. Children were not interruptions to serious adults. Again and again, Jesus forced religious people to look at the human being they had learned to avoid. So yes, Christians may care about immigration law. But if our first emotional response to deportation is cheering, something in us needs examination. Not because every deportation is automatically wrong, because celebration reveals formation. A Christian can believe laws should be enforced without turning enforcement into a spectacle. Support for border security does not require indifference when children are afraid. And wanting order does not cancel the question of whether the state is separating people in ways that wound families, churches, and communities beyond what justice requires. That is not weakness. That is conscience. And conscience is not the enemy of order. Conscience is what keeps order from becoming cruelty. This is where Jesus would press the church. He would not let us hide behind the easiest version of the argument. He would ask whether our politics has trained us to see certain families as less real, whether a slogan moves us more quickly than a child, and whether harshness sometimes gives us a dangerous feeling of strength. That last one is hard. But Jesus asks hard questions because he loves us enough to tell the truth. There's a kind of politics that turns compassion into embarrassment. It teaches believers to suspect mercy as soon as the wrong person needs it. It tells Christians that if they pause to ask about a family, they must not care about the law. It mocks grief as softness and treats tears as manipulation. Little by little, it trains the heart to become proud of being unmoved. Jesus would not call that strength. He would call it danger, because a heart that cannot be moved by a family in pain will eventually become dangerous in the name of righteousness. This does not mean Christians should stop caring about citizens, workers, public safety, or the rule of law. A country that cannot enforce any law becomes unstable. A government that lies about the border loses trust. Families in American communities deserve safety too. Local schools, hospitals, and neighborhoods should not be treated like they have unlimited capacity, while Washington performs morality from a distance. But Christians are not allowed to solve one injustice by becoming numb to another. Jesus stands above the excuse that compassion means there should be no law, and he stands above the excuse that law means there should be no tears. The way of Jesus is harder than both. It tells the truth about disorder without surrendering the neighbor to contempt. It honors justice without letting punishment become pleasure. It protects the country without making the vulnerable invisible. That is why this subject is so revealing. Immigration does not only test policy, it tests discipleship. It shows whether Jesus has authority over our instincts, not just over our Sunday language, and whether Scripture has formed our imagination enough to remember the stranger, the fatherless, the widow, the worker, the family, and the child who did not choose the legal mess adults created. Some Christians hear stranger and immediately get defensive. They think someone is trying to erase the law. But Scripture's concern for the stranger is not a loophole in national policy. It is a window into God's heart. The Bible does not ask Israel to remember the stranger because borders are meaningless, but because power makes people forget what vulnerability feels like. And America is very good at forgetting. We forget most easily when the person affected does not live on our street, when the story arrives through a political enemy's mouth, when the suffering family belongs to a group we have been trained to resent, or when our side is winning. Jesus would bring the forgotten back into view. The child who comes home from school and finds the house changed. The spouse who has tried to follow a system that keeps moving the finish line. The church that suddenly discovers one of its own families is not safe from the consequences everyone debated so confidently online, and he would bring us into view too. What happens inside us when we hear the word deportation? Do we become sober, prayerful, and careful? Or do we become excited because someone else is finally being made to pay? That question exposes more than policy. It exposes worship, because whatever makes us feel righteous without mercy is competing with Jesus for the throne of the heart. A lot of Christians want leaders who are strong. That is understandable. Weak leadership creates chaos. But in Scripture, strength without mercy becomes oppression. Order without justice becomes fear. Zeal without love becomes violence of the soul long before it becomes anything visible. The church should be able to hold two truths at the same time. America needs an immigration system that is lawful, honest, and secure, and families should not be treated as disposable material in the process of proving a political point. That is not compromise, that is moral sanity, and it is exactly the kind of sanity that disappears when politics becomes tribal entertainment. The danger is not only that families may be separated. The danger is that Christians may learn to enjoy the separation because it confirms a story they already wanted to believe. The story says there are good people and problem people, citizens and burdens, neighbors and invaders, families worth defending and families that do not count. Once that story takes hold, Jesus becomes inconvenient, because Jesus keeps crossing the lines we draw to protect ourselves from compassion. He tells a story where the neighbor is found in the person the religious listener least wanted to admire. He welcomes children when adults are too busy managing importance. He warns that whatever we do to the least of these, we do in the presence of the King, and he does not let religious people separate love of God from treatment of the vulnerable. That does not answer every policy question, but it absolutely judges the spirit in which Christians approach the policy, and maybe that is what we need most right now. Not another slogan or another performance of toughness. not another argument where everyone already knows what their side is supposed to say. We need the Spirit of Jesus to interrupt us before we become experts at defending policies we have stopped measuring by fruit. A Christian conscience has to ask whether a policy produces justice without cruelty, protects citizens without despising outsiders, honors law without mocking grief, and strengthens families instead of making brokenness more efficient. Those questions will not fit neatly on a campaign sign, but they may fit inside a conscience that still belongs to Jesus. There is also a warning for the church itself. Many congregations are more mixed and fragile than political commentators imagine. Immigration policy does not land on an abstract population. It lands on youth groups, Bible studies, marriages, workplaces, kitchens, and prayer requests. Some churches may discover that the family they prayed with on Sunday is the family at risk on Monday, and that those people were never those people at all. They were brothers and sisters, neighbors, co-workers, caregivers, and friends. That realization can become holy if we let it. It can make the church speak with more fear of God than fear of political backlash. Slow believers before they applaud the power of the state, and remind families that the rule of law needs conscience beside it, because law without conscience can become a machine, and a machine does not know what to do with a child's question at bedtime, the silence in a marriage after one seat is empty, or a church that becomes less merciful while claiming to defend righteousness. Jesus knows what to do with those things. That is why Christians cannot outsource their moral imagination to the state. Government can write policy and enforce law, but Jesus forms conscience, judges the heart, and asks what happened to the family, the neighbor, the church, and the soul of the people who watched. This is where the question becomes personal. Do I care about border security because I love my neighbor and want order? Or because I have been trained to see certain neighbors as threats? When I support enforcement, is my heart heavy or satisfied? Am I seeking justice, or do I want someone to suffer so my side can feel vindicated? Those questions are uncomfortable, but the discomfort may be mercy. Jesus is not asking Christians to abandon truth, law, or America. He is asking us to stop confusing harshness with truth, to stop treating law as a hiding place from love, and to love America with an unconquered conscience. So when Christians cheer deportations, Jesus would ask about the family. He would not stop at status, paperwork, or enforcement. He would press deeper toward the child, the spouse, the church, the cheering crowd, and the question of what all this is doing to the heart. And he would ask whether our politics is making us more like him, or simply more comfortable with someone else's pain. America needs order, honesty, and leaders who do not lie about a broken system. It also needs Christians who remember that being right about a problem does not give us permission to become wrong in spirit. That is the line, and if the church cannot hold that line, the country will not learn it from Washington. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because in the next episode we are going to ask another question that cuts into American faith and power. Would Jesus bless the language of war? Until then, remember this: the law may ask about status, paperwork, and enforcement, but Jesus will ask about the family. And if Christians forget to ask with him, we may win an argument while losing the heart he told us to keep.